Good morning. Our reading this morning is from Psalm 4. Answer me when I call to you, my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. How long will you people turn my glory into shame? How long will you love delusions and seek false gods? Know that the Lord has set apart his faithful servant for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Tremble and do not sin when you are on your beds. Search your hearts and be silent. Offer the sacrifices of the righteous and trust in the Lord. Many, Lord, are asking, who will bring us prosperity? Let the light of your face shine on us. Fill my heart with joy when their grain and new wine abound. In peace I will lie down and sleep. For you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, I've been away on holidays, and so maybe it'll be good to do some holiday snaps, and we could look at some photos of my holidays. But one of the things that I was thinking about is as I was travelling and having a holiday, there was just some little bits of news that would come in where potentially people who were excited about the year ahead faced some unexpected news about the direction that 2025 would take. And whilst we sometimes look at all of the issues of last year that were problematic, and we put on our rose-coloured glasses and look forward to our year, the reality is that many of us who've lived life long enough know that life doesn't always go according to plan. Now, I'm not a psychologist, and if you are going through some serious trauma, I do encourage you to seek appropriate counselling about it. But as far as I understand, when we think about the secular narrative about how life happens, the way that it tends to be portrayed, and many different authors use different terms because they're trying to create a unique model in order to sell a book, but it works out something like that the habits you engage in on a regular basis, plus experience over time, creates the person that you become. So, for example, if you eat junk food, you might think, well, that's not a habit that I'm intentionally doing, but if you eat poor food, over time, you'll actually lead to overweight and to a lifestyle that will have the implications of your prior decisions. In contrast, if you make a positive decision to have a habit of going to the gym and working on your fitness, then over time and experience and learning from all the different ways that your body responds to that exercise and gym, you'll actually end up with a positive outcome for your health. So that's how the kind of secular narrative, and there's various different trends and threads about that, and there's this kind of shift from self-help, which is you have to tough it out, to you know, external kind of you're shaped by your circumstances, but it kind of basically forms into something like that. Christian formation is a little different. Christian formation, it might sound similar, but there's fundamentally a different thread behind it. Christian formation is not the habits that we do, but it's the spiritual disciplines that we undertake. And rather than thinking about experience as though all experience is kind of neutral, in Christian formation, they talk about how we encounter suffering, how we deal with suffering, how we respond to suffering. And when we look at our spiritual disciplines, our spiritual habits, how we embrace suffering, and then when we understand that all of that is underpinned by a growing understanding of God's love, mercy, and grace towards us and our response to that, then that results Christian formation results in who we are. So if we have no spiritual habits because we kind of believe the secular lie that church isn't really that important and I can just be a Christian by myself, over time you can understand how when you go through suffering, you're actually not going to have a Christian community around you and you're going to be left to be by yourself to face your Christian suffering. If you have a spiritual discipline of engaging with church and engaging in small group, engaging in prayer, and your spiritual habits in good times are shaped by a community orientation, then when you embrace suffering, it's actually going to lead to a community around you that can support you, and also you can support one another as you go through suffering. Now, this is a book that I've been reading over the December-January period. It's by John Mark Comer, who's a millennial pastor in the US. So he's really actually taking the wisdom of prior Christian formation writers and writing it in language that millennials will pick up. And so John Mark Comer wrote a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which is all around how Christians need to avoid the hurry trap of our consumer society. And this book is really about practicing the way, being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing as Jesus did. So the spiritual habits that John Mark Comer is suggesting, but he's actually quoting numerous Christian formation writers throughout the last 100 years in his book, he's basically saying that the Christian habits that we should have are all shaped by the lifestyle of Jesus and doing what Jesus did. So we're not turning to a self-help book, we're actually turning to the scriptures, learning what Jesus did and helping that shape our understanding of how we embrace life. But I want to suggest to us that whether it's embracing suffering, or maybe there are some other authors that write it in different ways and use different terminology, but there are some people who are genuinely dealing with extreme suffering that we would probably in our society label as trauma. And when we look at what's going on in LA with the fires, there are some people who are dealing with real trauma. This is not just life didn't work out how they wanted it to. They're dealing with the complete loss of everything that they know and having to kind of rebuild their life from scratch. I don't want to list all of it, but you could think the same is probably happening in Gaza and Israel at the moment. The same is probably happening in parts of the Ukraine where they don't quite know from day to day whether they're in Russian territory or Ukraine territory. And we could list more because there's loads more that don't make the news. But there are some places in the world where there's extreme trauma and suffering happening. And I'd say that there's probably a different tack that we have to take with that, and I don't have the time today to help us understand that. If that's you and you'll find yourself in that, please seek appropriate Christian counselling for that. But the next level down is suffering that comes when circumstances significantly impact your life and change your circumstances. So it's like a person who goes to a doctor and gets a diagnosis of a cancer that's life-threatening. That's suffering that changes someone's life. There's also communal suffering, and I think of our neighbours at St Hilary's. They were enjoying a family camp. They'd planned out their year. There was many things that they were going to be facing this year. And on the Friday, and the family camp was supposed to be finishing on the Saturday, they get a call that the whole front foyer of their church is burning down and they can't meet there for an unknown, determined period. That's something that creates a communal suffering, a communal expression of grief. And how we respond to that is our Christian witness. How we respond to suffering is who we are becoming. Who we are becoming is not all of the good things that happen in life. It's not the avoidance of suffering. It's the embracing of suffering. And when we embrace suffering, we actually grow to be more like Jesus. I'll get to it, but Jesus embraced suffering. But we could also have, rather than significant loss or grief or suffering, we could also just have challenges. We could have some projects at work that we hoped went in a certain direction, but they didn't really go in that direction. And how we deal with that still is part of our Christian witness. It still shapes us. How we deal with challenges and hurdles is really important in our Christian witness to the world around us. And how we deal with minor setbacks when life doesn't go according to plan is part of our Christian witness to the world around us. And our reading today in Psalm 4 gives us many thoughts that we could have on how to deal with suffering, but I think it gives us 3 key thoughts. Now, the Psalms are wonderful for us when we're embracing things where life doesn't go according to plan, because the Psalms are full of stories of life not going according to plan. People who were seeking to do the will of God and they actually find that they're under attack, not just spiritual, but actually quite physical attack from invading armies. And so the Psalms remind us, and it gives us language of how to embrace life when life doesn't go according to plan, when we have challenges and hurdles, when we experience significant loss, and even when we experience major trauma and suffering. So the first point from our psalm today is to turn to God. The opening of our psalm, it says, "Answer me when I call to you. My righteous God, give me relief in my distress. Be merciful to me and hear my prayer." The psalmist is beginning the psalm by turning to God. It'll get to what's going on for the psalmist. That will come later, but notice that the first posture is to turn to God. You know, there's part of I'm not sure why, and look, I do this too, and I'm sure you do it, but there's part of us where we live in a society that demands success, demands us to have it all together, and we bring that into our spirituality. And so when something goes wrong, we don't turn to God as the first point of call. We think we somehow have to withdraw and fix our life up, and then we can step back into relationship with God, relationship with church, and relationship with the world around us. How many churches are embracing people having it not all together? And how many churches do people put on their Sunday best to turn up to church and have it all together? The very message of the Psalms is that when you don't have it all together, turn to God. We don't run away from God, we don't withdraw from God, but we actually turn to God when life doesn't seem to be going according to plan. When we experience hardships, when we experience hurdles, when we experience significant loss and grief, we turn to God because that's the posture that we are to have. The second thing in the psalm is that we are to continue to develop our spiritual habits. Now, the psalm doesn't actually use the term spiritual habits, but in verse 5 it says, in the midst of the trauma that this psalmist is going through, it says, offer right sacrifices and trust in the Lord. Offer right sacrifices. What the psalmist is saying is when things aren't going according to plan, when you're dealing with something challenging, when you're dealing with suffering, actually keep sowing into your spiritual practice. Now, in the day of the psalmist, that meant turning up to the temple and offering sacrifice, studying the Torah, engaging with community. That's what it meant. And I think the trap, at least in my lifetime as a Christian, the trap is that we've kind of taught people that there's this thing called solo Christianity, that somehow you can read your Bible and pray and that's all you need to do as a Christian. And I'm convinced more and more that spiritual habits, spiritual disciplines, whatever term you use for that, are developed in community. I think now, more than ever, we need to encourage people to go to church. I know that's not become trendy, and the trend has become a Christian and follow Jesus, but I think more and more we need to encourage people to go to church in good times and in bad times. Do you know, normal church attendance has become once a month. If you wanted to develop a habit at the gym, would you go once a month? If you wanted to go on a diet and fix your health, if the doctor said you needed to cut out gluten, do you think you could cut out gluten one meal a month and that would make a difference? I think more than ever we need to encourage one another to go to church, to be in community. Christian habits, spiritual disciplines, spiritual habits, whatever you call it, are developed in community. Prayer happens in community. Fasting happens in community. Having Sabbath rest happens in community. Singing and worship happens in community. We need to return to a community orientation of following Jesus, not this solo Christianity. In fact, St. Paul, right throughout all of his letters to the church, wouldn't even comprehend the concept of solo Christianity. If you're not in community, you're not following Jesus, according to St. Paul. And I think the church needs to return to that, even more so in 2025, when we're experiencing a loneliness pandemic. And the third point is to trust in God. The psalm ends with this idea of dwelling in God, who is our source of safety. I will lie down, I don't know what your verse says, but my translation says, I will lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. We need to trust in God when our circumstance doesn't seem to be going in the way that we want it to. Now, I'm not saying at all that God gives us difficult things in order to train us. In fact, in the letters of St. Paul actually says that he's reached the end of his limit in order that he turns to God. You know, there are people who say to you quite glibly, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Well, St. Paul would disagree. Sometimes we actually, when we realise that we've reached the end of what we can handle, that's our opportunity to turn to God, to trust in God, and know that God is sovereign over all things. But the goal of life is not to seek suffering. I know that I've portrayed a model here where Christian formation involves the embrace of suffering. But I don't want us to seek out suffering. We're not to spend our whole life in a state of suffering. I know there's been a period in church history where people sought out suffering, and physical mortification of the body was considered to be a noble thing to do. I think we've kind of realised that that was heresy, and the church luckily has moved on from that. We're not to seek out suffering, but we are to embrace it, and we are to see that when life doesn't go according to plan, it's part of our Christian witness to the world. How we handle suffering helps us to either be like Christ or to be like the rest of the world. You see, the reality is Jesus embraced suffering. Jesus lived in a world where people who had leprosy were not considered worthy of human dignity and were cast out. Jesus didn't say suffering was something to be avoided. People who were suffering were people to be embraced. The reason that Christianity is so radical in world history is because Jesus embraced those who were suffering and taught his disciples to embrace those who are suffering. Embrace the poor, the outcast, those who experience leprosy. That's what Jesus did. So if we want to become more like Jesus, and that's the point of our spiritual formation, our Christian formation, is to become more like Jesus, then we need to embrace those who are suffering. And I don't know about you, but I don't have to go far in my life to find people in my sphere of influence who are suffering. It's not that challenging to find people who need to be embraced as they deal with suffering. But the second thing is that Jesus actually took up the cup of suffering. When Jesus goes to the cross to make an atoning sacrifice for our sin, in the scriptures that's referred to as the cup of suffering. Jesus actually saw part of his key mission was to embrace the cup of suffering in order that he can redeem the whole world and make a way for all of us to be in right relationship with our Father in heaven. And so Jesus took up the cup of suffering. And so I wonder, if we think about our Christian formation, the way we're trying to become more like Jesus, are we being called to take up the cup of suffering in some way? I'm not talking about an atoning sacrifice. Only Jesus did that and can do that. But maybe not just accompanying somebody else going through suffering. Maybe we're encouraged to embrace challenges, hardships, setbacks or hurdles, significant loss in order to become more like Jesus. Not to try and take the easy path, but to be in the suffering like Jesus was. You see, how we handle suffering, how we handle challenges, and whether we have hope in the midst of suffering becomes part of our Christian witness. And I'll speak more about it in weeks ahead, and this will be our Lenten study for this year. But the Anglican Church of Australia is actually taking the theme of hope. That'll be our Lenten study, and then between Easter and Pentecost, there'll be a season of hope in the Anglican Church of Australia. How we handle suffering, respond to it, embrace those who are suffering, care for those who are suffering, is part of our Christian witness. And finally, as a church, I think this is critical for us as a church. How do we embrace one another? How is our church a community that cares for those who are suffering? How is our church a community that is caring for those who are facing significant challenges and significant hurdles? How do we reach out to those people and be community with them? You know, I don't know how to respond to St Hilary's and their community other than just to be present with them. So I heard about the news on Friday, the day that it happened, and so I got in the car and just went up to St Hilary's to see if anyone was around and just to see if I could help in any way. I'm not a firefighter, I'm not a risk assessor or any of that, but it's just being present to people. How we reach out beyond the borders of this church to other churches is part of our Christian witness. How we embrace others is part of our Christian witness. How the church gets on with one another, or whether the church in the public sphere is seen as fighting one another, is part of our Christian witness. Let's be people who are like Jesus, growing to be more like Jesus. People who are able to handle life when plans don't work out. Able to handle challenges and hurdles in a way that we still have hope and we still trust in God. Let's be people who, just like Jesus, who before he was about to embrace the cup of suffering, turned to God as his first response, not his last resort. As we face 2025, let's be people of hope. But let's also be people who know that life doesn't always work out as we planned, and have a plan for having a spiritual habit in good times that will sustain us through those challenging times. Gracious God, we praise and thank you for your Son, Jesus. We thank you that he modelled the way for us, that he embraced those who were suffering. Lord, may we have the courage to embrace those who are suffering. And Lord, as we go through challenges and hardships, setbacks and hurdles, may our nature and our way of dealing with that be part of our Christian witness to the world. And we make this prayer in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.